As consumers, we expect good food at decent prices. But beyond that, we generally don't think about what happens before our food reaches the shelves. And that is how a company like Tyson Foods can dominate the food industry. In 2020 alone, Tyson Foods processed 2 billion chickens, 22 million hogs, and 6 million head of cattle, giving it a total revenue of $43 billion. It's America's largest producer of meat and poultry, and its products end up in fast food restaurants, grocery stores, schools, and prisons all over the country. Now, you probably already know Tyson as a giant food company, but you may be shocked to learn just how much power this single company wields. Today, Tyson Foods has become so big that it not only controls the price of the meat we buy, it determines the financial well-being of thousands of people around the country. This is an invisible takeover that's been decades in the making. It involves a string of corporate takeovers and a system of food production that makes everyone suffer. It's time to pull back the curtain and reveal the secrets behind America's largest food company. And there's no better place to begin this investigation than in the small town of Springdale, Arkansas. It all began innocently enough. In the early 1930s, a newly married John Tyson and his wife were forced to leave his father's farm after the Great Depression set in and crop prices collapsed. The pair ended up in Springdale after their truck ran out of gas. There, John put his truck to use, hauling fruit to big Midwestern cities like Chicago and Kansas City. He wasn't making much, but it was enough to pay the rent and provide a meager living for his wife and newborn son, Don, who had just been born. Now, as part of his daily journeys, John would deal with a lot of farmers, most of whom were growing chickens. Back then, chicken was seen as a delicacy for anyone living in the cities. John saw a profitable opportunity. So, before long, he replaced fruit with chicken and started hauling live birds. And that's when he came to another realization. Chicken feed was expensive, and like it or not, every farmer had to buy it. So he started to make his own feed and sell it to the chicken growers himself. Then, to ensure that he always had a steady stream of birds, he opened his own hatchery, which he called Tyson Feed and Hatchery. That would later be renamed to Tyson Foods. What John was doing was something revolutionary. It's now called vertical integration. You see, with vertical integration, John realized that he could control every step of the production process, in turn giving him more power and bigger profit margins. But as you'll see, that desire for control has a very dark side to it. By owning the hatcheries that provide the baby chicks, and owning the feed mills that provide the feed those chicks consume, and by owning the slaughterhouses where the fully grown chickens are eventually killed and processed, John Tyson had essentially turned his farming operation into a well-oiled machine. A machine that resembled a factory more than it did a farm. With this model in place, business boomed under John Tyson, and things got even better when during World War II, beef and pork were rationed, meaning chicken was one of the only meat products that could be sold without restrictions. By the early 1960s, John Tyson had turned Tyson Foods into a truly successful company. But chicken farming was still a risky business, and there were other large companies out there that presented Tyson with stiff competition. To figure out how Tyson Foods went from this stage of success to where it is today, one of the most powerful companies in the world, well, we need to look at the next generation, specifically John's son, Don. Don Tyson grew up immersed in the chicken farming business. By the time his father died in 1967, he had plenty of ideas about how to expand the company. And of all of his ideas, the one that would make the most impact was his idea to buy out his competition. This turned out to be an ingenious move. You see, Tyson could have easily expanded on its own by building new processing plants and hatcheries. But if they had done that, that would have meant more birds being sold on the market. And with more supply, it would only have been a matter of time before prices collapsed. But by buying already existing operations, Tyson could take over more of the market without necessarily adding to the overall supply of meat. Don made his first acquisition in 1961, and he never looked back. One by one, Tyson started buying up slaughterhouses and feed mills across the country, and with massive loans from Wall Street investors, the company began acquiring competitors on an even larger scale. Soon, Tyson was at the forefront of an industry that was dominated by just a handful of companies, and the rate of takeovers only increased during the pro-government, anti-regulation years of the Reagan administration. As antitrust laws were watered down or removed altogether, Tyson found more room than ever to grow. In 1989, Tyson Foods doubled its size when it acquired Holly Farms for $1.5 billion. In 2001, they bought LBP, one of the country's largest beef processors, for $3.2 billion. As the company swallowed up their competitors one by one, they continued to build bigger and more sophisticated processing plants. And their acquisitions got bigger too. In 2014, they bought Hilscher Brands for $7.7 billion. Then in 2018, they bought McDonald's main supplier of chicken nuggets, Keystone Foods, for another $2.1 billion. In total, Tyson Foods made 47 acquisitions since 1995. That enormous size has allowed Tyson to gain an unbelievable amount of control over everyone in the chain, from farmers to workers to consumers. So let's start with you, the consumer. Now, during the first few decades of Tyson Foods' growth, that factory-style operating model, the industrialized farming that they pioneered, seemed like it was good for everyone involved. With their vertical integration, the Tysons increased their margins, farmers made a good living, and consumers paid less for their meat. But with each new phase in the company's growth, the amount of competition shrank. And with less competition, Tyson gained more and more power over the market. By the early 1990s, the benefits of industrial agriculture had completely evaporated. The gains made by antibiotics, genetic research, and new types of feed had pretty much been optimized as much as possible. And that meant the business had reached a tipping point. Raising chickens wasn't going to get any cheaper. Since then, the price of meat has been steadily increasing. Consumers have had to pay more and more, even as Tyson's profits continue to grow. In fact, between 2008 and 2009, at the height of the recession, Tyson doubled its operating profit margins. They doubled them again a year later. How did they manage this? Well, prices went up for consumers. But perhaps the most troubling part of this is the fact that one company was able to dictate the prices for an entire market. You see, because they control such a large part of the market, all they had to do was cut back meat production in order to curb supply. Cut production, prices go up. And it took only one company to make that decision. Since 2008, Tyson has engaged in that same kind of behaviour again and again. Most recently, coming under fire for allegedly gouging meat prices during the pandemic, when beef prices rose by on average over 20%, pork by over 16%, and chicken by 9%. Now, Tyson has caused price hikes once again. They argue that higher prices are needed to offset rising labour and feed costs. But these hikes come at a time when Tyson is projected to make an estimated $54 billion in sales this year, a record for the company. And given that their operating margins are also the highest they've ever been in the company's history, it's almost certain that they'll be announcing record profits as well. Now, if this was just about consumers paying more for meat, that would be bad enough. But Tyson's influence goes much deeper than just the supermarket. Let's now investigate the farmers who provide Tyson with all of their meat. Now, you might be surprised to learn that Tyson doesn't actually grow their own chickens. Instead, they rely on independent farmers to do that part of the job for them. Why then do they control every step of the process except growing the chickens? As you might expect, it's a very strategic decision, and it all comes down to profit. In the 1960s, meat production was a competitive industry. Profit margins were tight, prices were variable, and cycles of boom and bust drove companies out of business. In order to compete, the Tysons adopted a grow or die mentality. Their goal was to squeeze as much profit out of every step of the production process as they could, hence the buying of hatcheries, feed mills and slaughterhouses. But it was that logic that convinced Tyson executives that farming was actually a bad investment. In all other areas of their business, Tyson realised that if they invested in technology and equipment, they could bring down their labour costs. But that wasn't the case with chicken farming. Nature has its limits. No matter how many growth hormones or antibiotics you pump into the animals, chicken houses can only hold so many birds before they start to get sick and die. So Tyson let independent farmers take on that least profitable part of the business. But that didn't mean that they gave up control. Instead, they created a system in which the farmers became completely dependent on Tyson for their well-being. Some go as far as to say it's a relationship that's built on false promises. The first thing that happens is a Tyson representative goes out to a farm. They show a farmer the estimates of how much money they can expect to make, and they talk about how stable and profitable chicken farming can be. The farmer, having been told that all they need to do is care for the chicks, signs the contracts. After all, Tyson are the largest player in the industry. They haven't got too many other options to go with. But these chickens that they're about to raise, well, they need to be housed somewhere. So it's up to the farmer to construct the chicken houses, and those can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars each. In order to afford this, the farmer goes to the bank. He takes out a 6 or 7 figure loan. With the loan secured, the farmer is deeply in debt, but he's ready to receive his first batch of chicks, and that is often when the nightmare begins. Having signed exclusive contracts with Tyson, the farmer's income depends on the quality of chicks that Tyson provides. A good batch of chicks can mean making a modest profit, but a batch of sick or stunted chicks, well, that means a financial loss. One bad batch can set a farmer back thousands of dollars. Multiple batches like that and they can lose their farm. In fact, some farmers go as far as to allege that Tyson manipulates the system in order to keep them in debt. For example, Tyson can recommend upgrades, which the farmer under contract is forced to pay for. These can cost tens of thousands of dollars. Or, as many farmers claim, Tyson can allegedly choose who they send their poor quality chicks to. One bad batch of chicks and the loss that results in means you become even more reliant on Tyson for the next batch of birds. But there's one more element to Tyson's contracts that make them truly sinister: the tournament system. In the tournament system, your pay is based on how you perform in comparison to other farmers in your area. The top performers get a pay increase, but those at the bottom see their pay reduced, sometimes by as much as 50%. The result of all of these policies is that many farmers, or growers as Tyson calls them, end up defaulting on their loans and sadly losing everything. But as bad as the farmers have it, it's perhaps even worse for Tyson's actual employees. In their slaughterhouses, for example, they have one of the highest rates of severe injury among their workers. Within the walls of these megastructures, the Tyson workers undertake the already difficult task of gutting and butchering thousands of animals a day, but they're forced to do it at breakneck speeds. Under intense pressure to keep up the pace of work, some workers have apparently resorted to wearing diapers in order to avoid making the trip to the bathroom. It's no real surprise that Tyson had the highest rate of COVID-19 infections out of any other meat producer during the pandemic, yet it still pushed for even faster assembly line speeds. Their requests were eventually granted by the federal government, allowing many plants to exceed the already incredible rate of 140 birds per minute. And after the current CEO, John H. Tyson, the founder's grandson, took out a full-page article in the New York Times warning that the food supply chain is breaking, President Trump ordered meatpacking plants to stay open, invoking the Defense Production Act. Of course, John H. Tyson had a point. Shutting down just a few of Tyson's plants can cause serious food shortages, but only because they built the system that way. For years, Tyson strived to become too big to fail. Now, they've finally achieved their goal, and America's food will never be the same again. From a poor Missouri farmer determined to provide for his family to the largest meat and poultry producer in the country, the Tyson family has truly taken control of America's food system, making themselves billionaires in the process. Now, with all this talk about chicken, I've got a question for you. How long will KFC stay in business? If you haven't seen my investigation into the decline decline of KFC, I'll leave that video on screen for you to check out next.